That means go. We're streaming live now. All right. Welcome to the AZ Central newsroom, where we're streaming live to you the debate for Proposition 208, known as the Invest in Ed Initiative. We have two people here to give you both sides of it. David Lujan, speaking for it. Jaime Molera, speaking against it. We will have opening statements of about a minute, closing statements for about a minute, and in the middle of all that, I'll be asking these two gentlemen questions, trying to keep it fair, but a good, honest, open discussion, and given pretty much equal time for both of you. We shot dice as these two gentlemen came in, and the winner was former Superintendent Jaime Molera. You have a minute for your opening statement.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the Arizona Republic for sponsoring this this discussion and this hopefully lively debate. I'm chairman of the No Campaign. I served as the state superintendent of public instruction. I also served on the State Board of Education for 2 terms, actually appointed by Janet Napolitano the first term and John Brewer the second term. I'm a resident of Arizona, and I was born and raised. I'm from Nogales, but I've also been an 18-year small business owner. And one of the things that disturbs me about this initiative, it would create one of the highest marginal tax rates in the country. And it would indeed tax the top earners, but it would also tax top-earning small businesses, while all the while not putting one iota of accountability in this, so that we wouldn't know what kind of academic achievement is being gained or not. And as being a former state school superintendent and a school board member, as well as a businessman, I think Arizonans deserve to know if we're going to create a structure that would have a devastating impact on businesses, that we would want to know how much money is being used for actually things that are improving education.
Thank you so much. David Lujan, you have a minute for your opening statement.
Thank you, and thank you to the Arizona Republic for hosting this. I'm David Lujan. I'm the director of the Arizona Center for Economic Progress. We're one of 5 organizations behind Proposition 208. And for the last decade, no state in the country has cut more funding from its public education system than Arizona. And Arizona's public schools are operating today with less funding than they had in 2008. And our schools are feeling the ramifications of that in the form of one of the worst teacher shortage crisis. And new data was just released a couple of weeks ago showing that that teacher shortage crisis is getting worse, with more than 1,700 classrooms across the state without a qualified certified teacher. And we have some of the largest class sizes in the country. So Prop 208 will raise an estimated $940 million each year in revenue that is voter protected, that the politicians at the state capitol cannot touch, and that has strict accountability that can only be used for very specific purposes, including increasing teacher salaries and reducing class sizes, and 99% of the money will go into the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll start diving into questions. I mean, I guess as I've read about it, seen the commercials, heard the arguments, it seems like this boils down to a fundamental question of fairness. The proposition would create a surcharge, an extra tax on individuals making more than $250,000 or households making more than $500,000. Only those individuals or households would pay that tax. And Mr. Lujan, is that fair?
Yeah, you know, our state legislature has cut taxes every single year but one since 1990. It's part of the reason why we're in this situation with some of the most underfunded schools in the country. And many of those tax cuts have not gone to everyday Arizonans. Many of those tax cuts have been for corporations and the wealthy, the top 1%. And I'll give you one example. In 2011 and 2012, the very years that the state legislature was enacting the largest cuts in the country to public education, they also passed the largest capital gains tax cuts in state history, tax cuts that benefited the top 1%. And what that does is it makes the other 99% of Arizonans have to shoulder more of the costs for funding our public schools. And so our tax code has become very upside down, to the extent that the Arizona's lowest income families pay the 5th highest state and local income taxes in the country, where compared to our top 1%, they pay the 12th lowest state and local income taxes in the country. So we think that Prop 208 is a fair solution because it's asking those who have benefited from all those tax cuts to pay a little bit more to pay for our schools.
Mr. Miller, to you, is it fair?
No, it's not fair. I mean, it's kind of ironic that David mentions that this would be, they're chiding the cuts that were done to corporations in Arizona, but now you're going to have a scenario where you could have small businesses in Arizona be at an 8% tax rate, which would be one of the highest in the country, the 9th highest in the United States, and corporations will be paying a 4.9%. So explain to me how you have these large corporations paying less than what small businesses are doing. And by the way, one of the things that our No campaign has pointed out is that he mentioned that we have 5 organizations behind this. Well, we have over 65 organizations, business organizations, large and small, talking about how this is fundamentally a very dangerous initiative to Arizona's economy. And all the while, Richard, it doesn't have any guarantees of academic achievement. And that to me is just a nonsensical approach to deal with the education policy or economic policy.
The other question that people have had. Oh, sure.
Can I just respond? So, well, they talk about all these organizations that are behind it, but a lot of those organizations don't speak for small business owners that are saying that they're supporting Prop 208. And you know, part of how we're in this situation, I said, is all of these tax breaks. Prop 208 will not tax any small business entity itself. It's only individuals, and it's only the top 1% of the wealthiest individuals.
And to his notion of why it's individuals, households, including some small businesses, and not corporates, was that a calculated move? Why did you not choose to make the corporate tax rate higher as part of this?
Well, it's just flat wrong that the corporations will be paying a lower tax rate. Corporations in Arizona pay a flat tax rate of 4.9%. In Arizona, our income tax rates are graduated, which means you pay a portion of your income tax at varying rates, anywhere from 2.59 to 4.5%. And also, a lot of these business owners that Jaime's talking about, oftentimes they have multiple owners. And so each owner is only taxed on their individual income tax for their share of the corporate of the profit. So a corporation, in contrast, the entire net profits are taxed as one at 4.9%. So it's just flat wrong to say that small businesses are going to pay more than corporations.
Do you think it was a calculated move to not go after corporations?
Absolutely.
Like, would it have been tougher to pass had it been corporations?
Oh, absolutely it would have, because they know that the kind of resources that they've brought into the state, over $15 million of outside money, right? This is being funded primarily by Stand for Children, which is a national organization that's pumped in millions upon millions of dollars into Arizona, the National Education Association that's pumping millions upon millions of dollars. These are not Arizonans standing up and saying, oh, well, we're going to fund this and we're going to make sure we attack this. And to David's point about how these organizations don't represent small businesses, the Arizona Small Business Association doesn't represent small businesses. The National Federation of Independent Businesses doesn't represent small businesses. The Mesa Chamber of Commerce, the Metro Tucson Chamber of Commerce. These are organizations across the state, Richard, that are saying, time out. If we're going to do this, let's look at the ramifications of what it would do to economic progress in Arizona, which has been tremendous, and this would throw a wet blanket over it.
And I guess left unsaid was the notion that if it was corporations would spend to stop it. But we'll go there. Chamber of Commerce, is he right that they're against this? Small business associations are against this?
Those organizations are against it, but as I said, there's a number of small business owners that are saying that those organizations don't speak for them. There's a lot of small business owners that support Prop 208. Let me just talk about the money being used here. Our opponents have spent more than $18 million trying to defeat this. They haven't come up with any other alternative solutions to try and fix the funding crisis in our schools, but they're spending a lot of money to try and defeat this. And this is an Arizona solution for an Arizona problem. The Arizona problem is that no state in the country has cut more funding from our public education system. The Arizona solution is that more than 435,000 Arizonans came together in the middle of a pandemic to put their signatures on petitions to put this on the ballot because they're tired of the inaction at the state capitol. They want to fix the funding crisis.
Well, I guess to the funding crisis, if this doesn't go through, what is an alternative? Do you see the legislature, do you see the governor proposing something of this magnitude? Or is the funding just fine as it is?
No, it is not. And I've said that time and time again. I've both in being quoted by this entity. Being
Accurately,
quoted,
I hope.
Well, yes.
Okay, good.
And in forums, publicly, I've said absolutely, Arizona needs to do a better job of looking at how do we invest more into our education system, but doing it in a way that actually has a bigger bang for the buck. We have very significant equity problems within our system. You have school districts that have high property wealth, right, that other school districts don't, and that have access to bonds and overrides that can deal with a lot of those problems. Richard, you throw this in there where it's the money's just spread out, there's no accountability, it's like fertilizer over a field hoping that something beautiful is going to grow. And our point is that you have to look at investments, but look at strategic investments where actually can make a difference. But don't do it by creating the highest marginal tax rate structure in the country, that you have economists, you have business organizations, and you might not agree with those business organizations, but I think those business organizations that represent a lot of Arizonans and a lot of Arizona small businesses are saying time out. This is not the approach.
But do you see skepticism among the public that absent this, the governor, the legislature is going to fulfill what you say is inadequate school funding?
You know, one of the things that has happened over the last several years, which I think has been a good thing, is there has been a significant amount of priority by the governor and legislature on the K-12 budgets. And I think that has been a good thing. And that you cannot refute that there has been significant investment since the Great Recession, trying to get us back, hopefully, to where we were, but also trying to target two different areas that actually can make a difference. So the Prop 123, for instance, initiative that was done that forwarded the state trust lands is pumping in an additional close to $350 million a year into Arizona's education system. Now, that was a 10-year fix. We also put in place the systems that said we're going to count inflationary dollars, that we're not going to say that it's a side or extra money. That's just baked into the system. So there's been significant things that have done to improve our system. Now, do we need to do more? Yes. But do we need to create a structure that devastates business? No.
And I guess there's going to be voters out there who say, well, wait a minute. We had the state trust land pass. We had the governor's 20 by 2020 plan, which I always wanted to call the 20 by 20, but I've got it right this time. When is enough enough? When will, hasn't the education funding problem been solved? When will the education system say, oh yeah, we're good?
Well, when I mentioned that no state in the country cut more from their public education system over the last decade, more than $2 billion in funding was cut, there's still $1 billion that hasn't been restored. So we've made a few steps forward, but I'll give you an example. The pot of money that school districts are supposed to get every year to pay for classroom resources, things like curriculum and textbooks and technology, that's supposed to be funded at a total of about $371 million annually each year for all the school districts. They received zero in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, all the way up to 2018, zero. And now there's this legislature starting to phase in currently going forward, but they've never repaid the school districts for the money that they lost in all those years. And the implications of that, or the ramifications of that, is that you have school principals and superintendents for the past decade who have been having to make decisions like, do I fix the brakes on the school bus, or do I fix the leaky roof in the classroom, or do I retain the classroom aide who's so important for the teacher to help teach kids? And so those are the decisions, because we still have so much unfunded.
And I guess during that time you're talking about, we did have a global recession. Do you think, though, do you sense that there's a strain of voter out there who's saying, we have piled so much investment into the education system that let's see how this pays out for a while. Let's see if scores improve and education outcomes improve before we pump more in.
I think there might be some Arizonans, but I can tell you we have done a lot of polling over the last 3 or 4 years, and other organizations have done a lot of polling. And consistently, Arizonans will say that even now, even after this additional funds, Arizonans recognize that our schools are underfunded, and when you ask them, what's one of the top priorities that you see for our state going forward, and Arizonans overwhelmingly and consistently are saying, we need to put money into our underfunded school system.
Let's dive into the numbers a little bit.
But Richard, I think it's important to bring out, and those are important points when you talk about leaky roofs or fixing buses and school districts not having the wherewithal to do it. But that's not done from what the state provides in funding. That's not done from the maintenance and operation budgets. That's done from the capital budgets, and primarily for school districts, that's done by their local property wealth. So this will not do anything with that. This won't give any money to leaky roofs, or this won't give any money to.
And you think this will make people, especially if they go to voters for bonds, it will make them less inclined to approve bonds?
But what it's being sold as, it'll help school districts and school leaders address these kinds of issues. And that's my point, Richard. School finance needs to be looked at, and we need to have a real, genuine fix. This being put in place, in our opinion, creates a structure that doesn't fix all these things, doesn't even come close to fixing it, but at the same time could create a system, an economic system that could be very damaging to our state.
Leaky roofs to you. Can this money fix leaky roofs?
No, this money doesn't fix the leaky roofs, but all of those cuts that I've mentioned has put superintendents and principals into those difficult decisions. And so what they're having to do is the limited funds that they have that they can use for varying purposes, they've got to make those difficult decisions. And so what this money will do is it will free up, it'll alleviate some of the stress on school district budgets that they've been having to deal with now for 2 decades.
One bucket to another, which is a leaky roof metaphor. Thank you. Thank you. Let's dive into the numbers. According to the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, which is sort of the state's neutral bean counters, it seems like this would affect somewhere between 1 and 4.6% of taxpayers. For those making up to $500,000, above $200,000 to $500,000, the average increase $120, according to the JLBC. $500,000 to $1 million, about $5,500, and it gets up to $5 million and above. Will have the largest hit, $353,000 tax hit, but that affects 956 filers only. Again, according to the JLBC. Do you think this impact alone would be enough to dissuade corporations or individuals, wealthy individuals, from moving to Arizona?
Oh, absolutely would. I mean, we have individuals that are working in this field of economic development and recruitment into Arizona who have said absolutely would have a massive impact. And then on top of that, Richard, I want to read a quote from an organization that talked about how Prop 208 is an extreme proposal with more pitfalls than promise, that deepens the divisions of our society and puts the state's economy at risk. Now, you would think that came from maybe the Goldwater Institute or the Free Enterprise Club, or maybe even Americans for Prosperity, that tend to be conservative organizations that would have the kind of rhetoric that David is saying that we're using. That came from the editorial board of the Arizona Republic. So I think when people start to look at this and start to look at the data and start to look at that the payers of this tax are going to be 50% small businesses, and that Arizona has a structure where 58% and this is from the Tax Foundation, that shows 58.3% of Arizonans work for these kinds of pass-through organizations, the LLCs, the S-Corps, that are the ones that pay individual income tax and not corporate tax. Mm-hmm. And that equates to 1.1 million, according to the Small Business Association, people in these kinds of small businesses.
This would be a good time for clarification that the editorial board, as you gentlemen know, is different from the newsroom where I work and my colleagues work. They're literally as far away from this end of the newsroom as possible. So yes, we have an editorial board that passes judgment and gives their opinion on things, but that's not reflective of the newsroom, just in case you're wondering out there.
And if I could
but yes, do you think that, how do we be sure that a high tax environment is not going to wreck Arizona's economy?
Right. So, and I do know that there's the separation between the editorial board and the reporters. But with all due respect to your editorial board, I think they got that op-ed wrong. And part of it was they were citing in their op-ed a study that was done by our opposition that Jaime just mentioned about millionaires not wanting to come to our state if this passes. And our opposition in that study, they cited a leading report of the guy who studies millionaire migration and the impact on state tax rates. And he actually looked at our opposition's report, and this is a Stanford University professor, and he said they got it all wrong. He actually said they misinterpreted his findings, and then when he looked at Proposition 208, this is Dr. Cristobal Young from Stanford University, he actually concluded that with Proposition 208, we are going to see a continuation of growth in our millionaire population. That in his conclusion, in his reports, have consistently said that state tax rates don't impact millionaire migration like our opposition's, sky is falling doomsday claims. What people look for when they're in that high income tax bracket is the quality of life, the quality of the public schools. And that's what Prop 208 does. It invests in our public schools to improve that quality of life.
And briefly, since we're in the weeds, some of the opposition has said this is not inflation index that people making, say, $200,000 now might find themselves paying this in a few years. Is that the case?
This doesn't index for inflation, but what this does is it taxes, as I said, that top 1% of the wealthiest Arizonans. And so the inflation index, it changes a very little. So you're not going to see much movement of that over the years.
Inflation index? I know that was an issue.
Well, that's hilarious because when the state years ago was indexing inflation for K-12, they made it, this is the sky's falling. This is terrible that we're not doing this. And we should have been doing this, but that's where this is being obfuscated. Richard, what we're talking about is a situation because they don't index this to inflation. Even though our state taxes are indexed to inflation, even though our federal taxes are indexed to inflation. In 2000, when I ran the Prop 301 campaign, the only successful tax increase for K-12, and the reason it was successful because we had education leaders and businesses working together to say, hey, this is how you do it and do it right. But the fact of the matter is, if at that time when that was passed, you had a person making $160,000, because of inflation, which is a real thing, they'd be at $255,000 now. So you see over time, more Arizonans and more Arizona small businesses are going to fall into this nefarious tax.
The Joint Legislative Budget Committee, in their analysis, described this bill, this measure, generating $827 million in revenue, a bit off from the projections of $940 million that your side had. It also called the estimates speculative and subject to change because essentially higher income taxpayers can shift around. They have techniques that maybe you and I don't to shift their money around, and maybe small business owners won't invest as much. How will districts deal with revenue numbers that the state says are erratic? How will districts budget that?
Well, first of all revenue streams can be volatile and can go up and down. It's not going to go down to the point where it's going to be a significant difference from year to year. And I'll tell you, the volatility that school districts have already been dealing with for the past 20 years is not by the up and downs of revenue streams. It's by the politicians at the state capitol, our state legislature, cutting year after year funding that they're entitled to. I mentioned the funding for school classroom resources. Just a year and a half ago, our state had a $1 billion budget surplus. You would think that year of all years, the school districts could have received the entire $371 million they were entitled to for additional assistance. The legislature funded them at $135 million. So that was effectively a $200 and some million cut. And the same year, the legislature passed a $380 million tax cut. That's the kind of uncertainty, the volatility that school districts are having to deal with. Prop 208 takes that uncertainty out of the picture because it puts it in a separate fund that the politicians at the state capitol cannot touch.
That they get, for sure, something every year.
Every year.
What do you say to this volatility argument?
Oh, it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. When you create a tax on the top marginal tax rate, any economist worth their salt will demonstrate that the volatility of this, when we had the Great Recession, for instance, that was one of the hardest hit tax revenue systems that we have. And just look it up with Arizona Department of Revenue. The sales tax did go down, but it was much more stable. Our property taxes went down considerably because Arizona was a growth state and that's where the bubble burst. But the capital gains were non-existent in Arizona. And you had people have literally almost year to year, for 3 years, 30% drop in the income tax rates. So Richard, it is a real issue, but one of the things that strikes me as disappointing is that the Yes campaign will say, well, we have a professor from Stanford that says X, but yet when we have economists, noted economists like Jim Rounds or Elliot Pollack, or organizations like the Greater Phoenix Leadership or Southern Arizona Leadership Council, or I can go on, go on our website, noprop208az.com, and it lists all these organizations. So how are all these organizations, how's the editorial board how our economists all getting it wrong, but yet they have that one Stanford professor that says, oh, no, don't worry about it. We're going to be able to cover it.
The JLBC also talks about the proposal possibly acting as an economic stimulus because it would put more money in the hands of teachers. Do you see that? And that could lift up general fund tax collections, sales tax, income tax. Do you see that as a valid argument?
So, Richard, when you look at the squeeze and the kind of the little juice that we get from this thing, when David was talking about some of the increases that have happened, in fiscal year 2000, the education system received, not including Prop 301 funds, but received close to $600 million, $571 million in new dollars. That's on top of inflation. That's on top of Prop 301. So those dollars primarily went to teachers because that was part of the 20 by 20 initiative. Let's say, for the sake of argument, this does what the JLBC says, whereas we already have, as per their documentation, with the way they've structured this, 50% goes to either existing classroom teachers or hiring new classroom teachers. So how does that solve all of the problems of not having enough teachers in the classroom? How does this solve the problem of getting qualified teachers in rural areas where we don't have the math and the science teachers are? I just think before you start creating a structure that can damage Arizona's economy, like all of these myriad of business organizations and qualified economists are talking about, that's just very, very risky policy.
Is the teacher stimulus real? Is that a side benefit, or is it going to be something that Arizona can?
It will be huge for teachers in Arizona. I mean, this was put together with teachers. I think ask the people who are in the classroom every day who see the issues and understand why we have one of the worst teacher shortage crises in the country. It's because of the lack of adequate teacher pay, but it's also because of the lack of the resources around them for mentoring programs, for having classroom aides, and all the other people that go into helping to educate a student. And that's what Prop 208 does, is it provides those resources for schools that have been sorely lacking over the years because of all the cuts. I also just want to go back to what Jaime said about the economist reports. I guess we can have dueling economists because we had our own economist, Dr. Enrique Lopez, Lira, who did a report that showed that when you invest in your economy, that's good. You can ask any state and national economists, and they will say one of the smartest investments that states can make to grow their workforce, to strengthen their economy, is to invest in your public education system. And that's why a number of Arizona's neighboring states and a number of states around the country have actually increased their investments into public education. And Arizona's been falling further and further behind.
And briefly, he mentioned teacher shortages. How do you see this affecting the teacher shortage crisis?
I think it'll go a long ways towards resolving, if not resolving it. I mean, one of the things that we have seen is why are teachers leaving? It's the low pay, which is near the bottom, less than most of our neighboring states. And it's also the lack of mentoring opportunities for first and second year teachers. We're losing a lot of teachers after the first or second year. School districts used to be able to have more resources to mentor teachers in their first or second years. Because of all the cuts, they've had to do away with a lot of those programs. Prop 208 brings those resources back.
Fundamentally, higher teacher pay would bring more teachers, no?
Well, but again, when you have a structure where you have school districts in Arizona that live in the affluent areas or have access to high commercial businesses that pay higher property taxes, they are by and large dealing with the teachers. They don't have teacher shortages in a lot of these school districts. They don't have problems with trying to find money for special education. They don't have money fixing the leaky roofs or fixing the buses. They're able to deal with that because they have that tremendous wealth. A lot of school districts during the Great Recession never saw cuts to their actual budgets. Now, a lot of them did. And again, that goes back to why we need to have a fundamental approach. Now, Richard, I was a part of what I consider to be the best, one of the more rewarding things in my life, which was the Prop 301 initiative. And the reason I was rewarding is because we had a lot of naysayers. We had a lot of folks that didn't want to do it. But it was crafted by sitting down with business leaders, sitting down with educators, and saying this is how you do something that actually can get more money into the classroom, get more money to teachers, where we said not a dime goes to administration, but this is going to go to teacher pay. And at the same time, we said, how can we do this that we're not going to tank Arizona's economy? So that's the kind of structure that needs to be looked at here. Unfortunately, this Yes campaign never reached out to any of the major business organizations or minor business organizations. Well, you talk about organizations like GPL, which is not considered to be a right-wing organization. They're very thoughtful. They have been arguing for more education funding. They weren't approached, and they've been the leaders in a lot of the business groups.
The GPL, Greater Phoenix Leadership?
Greater Phoenix Leadership.
What kind of outreach was done?
A lot of outreach and a lot of unsuccessful attempts. So, you know, we tried unsuccessfully in 2018 to put this on the ballot. I think it was the day after we were removed from the ballot. Our coalition held a press conference, and we said, we're going to continue working together because we recognize there's still a funding crisis in our schools. And we're going to wait to see whether the legislature or others come forward with a plan to fix the funding crisis in our schools. And if they don't, we will be back in 2020. And so our opposition had 2 years to come up with a plan that they thought was better. They didn't do it. They had all the years before that. They didn't do it. And that's why we're here, is because Arizonans are frustrated with the inaction at the state capitol, and Proposition 208 is the plan to fix that funding crisis. I was personally in meetings with business leaders that we looked at all types of revenue options. We looked at property tax and sales tax and this income tax and different variations. And after a while, we never heard from the business leaders again. They lost interest, or they just simply didn't want to come forward and do anything.
With two longtime Arizona politicians, we could probably talk about the history of the Voter Protection Act, which is actually related to medical marijuana and legalization of marijuana,
right.
which is tomorrow night's debate. But the Voter Protection Act makes it so that if the voters, through an initiative, not a referendum, but an initiative, pass something, it is nearly impossible for the legislature to tinker with, even if there are problems with it. This is a major tax bill. Why not wait to see what the climate is in January at the state capitol and see whether this could be passed by something that can be tinkered with by lawmakers, as you know, being in the state capitol, that can be tinkered with if there's a comma in the wrong spot when this passes. Why is it important to have this as an initiative that is voter protective, which is a little scary?
I would love to have been able to do this through the legislature, but as we've discussed, we've been waiting for the legislature to do something about the funding crisis in our schools for 2 decades now, and they have not come up with a plan. And so this is what we're faced with. It's also very difficult to be able to raise revenue. It only takes a simple majority to cut taxes in our state legislature, but it takes a 2/3 vote of both chambers in order to raise revenues. And since that constitutional requirement went in place back in 1990, it's been virtually impossible to raise revenue in the legislature. It's only been done once, to my knowledge, and that was only to continue an existing tax that was set to expire. And so that's why we have Proposition 208. People in Arizona know that we have a funding crisis in our schools. They're frustrated with inaction at the state capitol. And so this is the way we can do it, is for voters, more than 435,000 voters, coming together in the middle of a pandemic with their masks and gloves and disposable pens to sign petitions to get this on the ballot.
Let's talk about the current tax structure.
And by the way, the organization that collected those signatures was paid $4.2 million by these outside organizations.
And I know you were not a lawmaker, but you're very familiar with how the Capitol works. The tax structure now, someone in Arizona making $53,000 annually has the same tax rate, 4.17%, as someone making 3 times that. And those who make more than that just pay 0.4 of a percentage point more. Is our existing income tax structure fair?
Well, Richard, I think it is fair. There's a lot of things that need to be done, and a lot of things that need to be done, as I've conceded, on education funding. But let's look at the facts. I want to go back to one issue that David talked about. In fiscal year 2019, Arizona put in an additional $495 million of new dollars into the K-12 system. We put in the next fiscal year, $571 million of new dollars into the system. So I think it's important to look at this from an incremental approach of how do we start to significantly deal with some of the problems of getting teachers in areas that don't have it, of making sure there's better equity within the system, of dealing with the kinds of things that actually do something for academic achievement and academic growth. When you talk about economic policy, Arizona's been able to do that because our tax system has been competitive. we've been able to draw in, we've been one of the hottest states as far as job creation prior to COVID. And now we're going to create a new system on top of a pandemic when we are facing, literally, businesses are going to be shutting down. You throw this on top of that, and you're going to exacerbate the problem.
And to be fair, a chunk of that money, I think you'd concede, came out of the Capitol because teachers did what they did and marched
absolutely.
from the ballpark to the Capitol. Do you see the climate? Do you see the climate at the Capitol changing when it comes to education funding?
I think budgets are about setting priorities. And the priorities shifted in Arizona because the Arizonans said, we believe there needs to be more dedication of resources into what it is that we think is important. Not by taxing small businesses, not by creating one of the top tier tax rates, not by doing what Connecticut did or New Jersey did or the states on both extremes of the coast, California and New York, where that's not proving to be successful. We've been able to, because we've been competitive, because we've been able to grow jobs, that to me is a much superior approach of how we can make sure that Arizona is not only thriving, but then be able to deal with and invest in the kind of things that can make a difference. Not just in education, but in Medicaid, but in our roads, our infrastructures. This would be a risky plan to jeopardize all those other things.
I'll let you respond to the word incremental.
Well, I would address job creation. I think one of the things that this COVID pandemic has taught us is that it's everyday Arizonans who are the job creators. If Arizonans are not going out and buying things in the store or eating out in restaurants, our economy suffers. And what's one of the most effective strategies that we can do to put more money in the pockets of people to increase their earnings is to invest in our public education system. And so I think investing in education is a job creator because you're investing in our future job creators, which is our students. I also just want to address, because it's been brought up a couple of times, the outside money. Stand for Children is an Arizona organization consisting of thousands of parents across the state. Their executive directors, Rebecca Gao, a Republican who worked with Governor Brewer and her administration, hardly some sort of out-of-state person. That she's longtime education advocate in Arizona. This is an organization that speaks for parents across the state.
And briefly, because he mentioned COVID, have you crunched the numbers about how the COVID pandemic would affect this if it passes in its first year?
Well, we talked about the volatility. One of the things that we're seeing in this current economic crisis is that the people at the top are actually faring much better. Everyone's suffering, but the people at the top economically are doing much better than the people at the bottom. And so I think that you're going to see that in this economic crisis, you're going to see that the revenues at the top are going to be very stable, much more stable than the income at the bottom.
And do you see that same stability or that same lack of impact at the top 1% in Arizona?
What you're going to see in Arizona are...
COVID related.
You're going to see a lot of businesses that, right now, I'll give you an example. The tourism industry has lost $1 billion in Arizona. They've lost nearly 60% of the folks that were coming into the state, staying here, going to our restaurants, partaking in the great lifestyle that is Arizona. So the Arizona Lodging and Tourism Association has come out unanimously to say this would be horrible. You throw this on top of what we're dealing with now, trying to climb out from COVID, and yet now you're going to put on a tax rate where we're going to come back into that situation where you have hotel owners and small hotel owners that are saying to us, we're done at that point. That's the reason, Richard, I think when you talk about education policy and when you talk about what we need to do, we need to be very thoughtful about it. I think there has been some incremental things that have been successful. I think Prompt 123 has been successful. I think we've had more of a budget priority put in place, which I think has been successful. Is that the be-all, end-all? No, of course not. But you can't create a structure where you harm Arizona businesses and Arizona jobs because you have what I honestly think a Bernie Sanders-esque wealth distribution approach that philosophically the progressive community might like, but it doesn't do anything for Arizona businesses.
Let's break down where the money would go. 50%, if it passed, 50% would go for hiring and raises for teachers and classroom support personnel, 25% for hiring and raises for student support services personnel, 10% for teacher retention, 12% to the career training and workforce fund, which is going to be newly established, 3% to expand the Arizona Teachers Academy, which essentially if you're a college graduate and you go to teach in Arizona school, you get a tuition break or a waiver. Two things on the money breakdown. Could you explain to us what the Career Training and Workforce Fund is? 12% of the money goes to that. That's new. Secondly, teachers and classroom support personnel. I know the No side has made some hay about the expansion of what a teacher is. Could you address both of those?
So the career and training is for career and technical education programs. This will actually more than double state funding for career and technical education. These are the programs, mainly in high schools, that provide students with critical skills to fill high demand, high paying jobs in our workforce. The budget cuts over the years have seen a lot of cuts to career and technical education, and so this will boost, more than double state funding for career and technical education, which is also a big benefit for rural economies as well. The teacher...
Oh, and just to dumb that down, like we're talking like auto shop or...
Right. It's
okay.
Those types of programs, yes.
All right.
The teachers, the opposition has made this deal about how we're expanding the teacher definition. Basically, that money goes to any position that's non-administrative that requires a license or certification because they work usually very closely with students. Those are typically school counselors and behavioral therapists. We have the highest, I believe, student to counselor ratios in the country, one counselor for every 900 students. So you talk about COVID pandemic and talk about keeping kids healthy and safe. Prop 208 is going to allow school districts to hire school nurses and school counselors, which will keep kids healthy and safe.
Like anyone who essentially faces a student.
Exactly.
Is that the proper definition of teacher, classroom support personnel? Again, the No side has made much of the expanded definition of teacher.
Well, because this is trying to be all things to all people and trying to buy votes by saying, oh, we're going to give some to here, we're going to give some to teachers, we're going to give some to counselors, we're going to give some to all these different areas. But when you do that, you really don't make those kinds of strategic investments that I think can make a difference in academic achievement. There's nothing in here that talks about how these dollars are going to be used. There's no description, unlike, again, I refer to Prop 301 because we brought people together. We said not a dime of this goes to administration. This really, because if you're going to tax Arizonans, let's talk about how those dollars should be used and how this goes to academic achievement. This does none of that. So I guess the issue that I take when talking about career and technical education, I'm working on a project with the Greater Phoenix Chamber in partnership with a number of charter schools and the Phoenix Union District. There are a myriad of things that have to happen that are not, from a policy standpoint, make any sense to be dumping a lot of money into something where you still have fundamental problems within the CTE system. That's what we're talking about, Richard. Getting down and businesses working with education and actually doing something that's thoughtful and reasonable, not just saying, okay, we're going to instill this progressive tax policy and we're going to just give it out to everybody and everybody's going to be happy and it's going to cure cancer.
He's brought out the Bernie Sanders and the progressive. But I want to ask you about it because he also brought out early on accountability. What is it in here that makes sure that the dollars are spent where they're spent? What are penalties? How can taxpayers hold school districts accountable for properly spending this money?
Yes. So the language, the plain language of the initiative says that it can only be used for very specific purposes. It cannot be used for any district administrative costs. And then school districts are already audited regularly by the Arizona Auditor General's Office. This will be at the local school boards that have local control. So just like we have now, if school districts are misspending the dollars, they would be caught in those audits. We feel very strongly that there's this strict accountability in terms of, our opposition has made a lot of claims about districts wasting money. The Auditor General and the United States Census have said that Arizona spends the least amount of administrative costs in the country. And so our schools have actually done a very efficient job in managing very limited resources over the years to make sure that they're educating our kids.
Richard, I have to make a point on that because I was personally attacked on that very quote. I never said they're wasting money. I said there was and is an Auditor General report that says 55 cents of every dollar makes it to the classroom. That's the Auditor General's data. The problem is that you have, well, the good news is you have some school districts and you have some charter schools that do a phenomenal job. I think that they're very vigilant. But we also know that there are schools and school districts that don't do as good a job. And our point is, you're creating a very volatile tax. You're going to be hitting small businesses. You're creating one of the top tier taxes in the country. And yet, and I'm sorry, but I've read through your initiative, I don't know how many times. I cannot find, and if you can point it out to me, I'd be very appreciative, where they say that no administrative costs can be used in this thing, because it's just not there.
Well, there's nothing, I mean, it spells out where the dollars should go. Do you think that?
But there's no
pointing out where
prohibition
they
against
should-
any
okay.
kind of administrative dollars, and there's no guarantee.
And is are the current, not to make you argue for more government, but are the current auditing requirements for school districts enough to catch what you see as a potential for fraud?
Well, but there's no
Waste.
accountability in this, Richard. That's my point. So if we're going to be doing this, and if we're going to be going through the process of creating such a large tax structure, that as been pointed out again by the editorial board, that's an extreme proposal with more pitfalls than promise, then we got to figure this out. We should have been working together to do this. And I go back to the point where I just respectfully disagree. There was not a lot of outreach done on this. It was the AEA working with Stanford Children, which is funded. They're based here. I'll give them that, but their money's coming from out of state.
And in contrast, because I don't know the answer to this, did the proposition you led had the kind of accountability measures you're asking for?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We said not one dime went to administrative costs. It had, and it spelled out exactly how it went. As a matter of fact, I tell the story how back then, the AEA president, Penny Cotterman, was chastised. She was attacked by her own organization, the NEA, because she had the gall to say that some of this money was going to go for merit pay for teachers. Now, we didn't prescribe it. We just said, let's work together and have the school districts design a system, which led to school grades, which led to teacher evaluations. I mean, it led to a lot of great things that really impacted student achievement. But Richard, that's the kind of thing that really needs to happen in order to have effect, to make sure wherever a kid lives in Arizona, they have access to a quality
And
education.
there was a line in the
Absolutely.
in the Texas Senate. And I'm adding it up: 50, 25, 10, 12, 3. I did go to Arizona Public Schools, but that's 100 to me. Is that enough, or should there have been a line in there that said, this is where the money goes and not to administrative costs?
It actually does. If you read it, if you look at the definitions, it says non-administrative personnel, both in both of the two major pots where the money goes for salaries. So we feel it's very clear. As I said, the Auditor General conducts audits. The examples that were given of districts where they've wasted money, they've been caught, and it's very few examples. School districts, I hope Jaime would agree that we don't see very much waste in our public schools. They have been doing an excellent job with very limited resources.
The last time this was proposed, in the last election cycle, you mentioned it didn't survive a court challenge. Again, you've had 2 years, I guess. So I guess I'm answering my own question. How confident are you that the proposal that you've laid out, that there's no pitfalls in here, that it is as you are promising the voters?
Very confident. We've studied this for a long time. There's been a lot of eyes on it. Our opposition has spent $18 million against us trying to point out pitfalls. I don't think they've done a very good job of pointing those pitfalls out, because I think most Arizonans are still very excited about voting on this, because they recognize that this is the solution to get the money into our classrooms where it's needed.
Mm-hmm.
With this effort, Mr. Molera, you were the named plaintiff. Mm-hmm. And maybe you had a deep feeling about the necessity of the 100-word summaries on all propositions being accurate, or maybe this was a concerted effort to stop this from getting on the ballot. Why has the no side fought so hard in court to keep this from the ballot?
Well, because, as you mentioned, with Prop 105, it's a Voter Protection Act, that when initiatives happen in Arizona, it is nearly impossible to change. And there's no ability, even with better information, better data, or let's say we do have another recession, which we know we're going to have, that happens in markets, and you have that volatility in the system where teachers are going to be left with 1 year they get $1,000, next year they may not get as much. So there's not stability within the system. And the point is, by not being able to address those kinds of things, or not being able to address what could be a problem of losing, like other states have seen, where New Jersey, I've mentioned, they witnessed massive amounts of capital exodus from their state, massive amounts of job loss. And if you go on, again, no prop208az.com, We have all that laid out of what's happened in other states, economic analyses, as well as the various business organizations that are talking about don't do this to our state when we have an opportunity to get out of this pandemic, grow jobs again, and put Arizona where we should be, where we can actually get the revenue to deal with these problems.
Why do you think they fought so hard to keep this from the ballot?
They want to maintain the status quo. They don't want to see tax increases. Like I said, they've had 2 years and many more years before that to come up with a proposal. And I think the bottom line is they would have opposed any proposition proposal we would have come forward with. This is the same group that opposed the minimum wage initiative in 2016 with many of the same sky is falling doomsday scenarios back then, that small businesses were going to be hurt, people were going to lose their jobs. Those claims never came true. Our economy, as they acknowledge, has been very strong before the pandemic. And so just like that, the claims they're making about Prop 208 are false as well.
And Richard, that's why I have to say, David tends to make out, in the Yes campaign, tends to make out the business community as this monolith. But again, I point out to you, you do have organizations that oppose initiatives like the minimum wage. You have Goldwater Institute, Free Enterprise Club, Americans for Prosperity. But you also have organizations like the Greater Phoenix Leadership, like Southern Arizona Leadership Council, the United Dairymen of Arizona, the Arizona Lodging and Tourism Association. So you have a number of organizations that are saying this is bad policy. Now, we can disagree on the difference between conservative thought and progressive thought, but when you have as many organizations that has come out against this, when you have as many thought leaders that said this is bad policy for the state, and it doesn't give us one iota of confidence that Arizona's academic achievement is going to improve. We don't know if kids are going to be reading at grade level by the 3rd grade. We don't know if kids that graduate are going to need remedial education as they move on to higher education. That's the kind of accountability that Arizonans should demand and expect.
Well, we're going to bring this thing in for a landing.
Can I just respond to that real quick? So I served as a principal for ASU Preparatory Academy for 3 years. And, Jaime mentions kids struggling to read. And I know that, in a lot of research out there shows that if in those first few years, kindergarten through 3rd grade, if a student isn't reading at grade level by the end of the 3rd grade, they're likely going to struggle for the rest of their academic career. And think about where we're at now with kids entering kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade with a teacher shortage, oftentimes maybe with a substitute teacher in those critical years in overcrowded classrooms. Is that the future we want? Prop 208 seeks to address that.
And I guess, again, we're going to bring this thing into a landing. Paint a couple scenarios here. What does a school, a classroom look like if this passes and if this fails?
Well, I think if it passes, we're going to have a school or classroom where there's not going to be any accountability. I think we're going to have a school or classroom where the teachers have been promised that all of these issues that are being talked about, whether it's early childhood literacy or whether it's fixing leaky roofs or whether it's fixing the buses that aren't being able to drive, all of these things are not going to get done. I mean, it is significant monies, and we do need to put significant monies in. I think Arizona's done a good job over the last 3 to 5 years of making very steady incremental progress to start to deal with these issues. And Richard, that's where good policy and good budgeting is undergirded by a strong economy. And if this were to pass, it would really hurt Arizona's economy. The sky wouldn't fall, but the bottom will fall out. And that's where I think the difference is between the No campaign and the Yes campaign. The No campaign believes we shouldn't be hurting Arizona's economy for something that has zero accountability and no guarantees to Arizona's parents that this will actually produce something of value for their students.
And same question to you. Paint a picture of a classroom, a school, passage, and failure.
Well, we know the picture that we want. Expect More Arizona in conjunction with business leaders, education leaders, government leaders, for the past few years have been developing the Arizona Progress Meter, which is a series of metrics of where we want to be in 20, 30 years for our education system. And money isn't going to solve all of those issues or get us to those goals. But many people have put up a lot of good solutions on how we can reach those education metrics. And I think virtually every one of them requires schools to have more resources in order to be able to do that. And so my thought, my hope, my belief, and I think a lot of people who signed the petitions to put Prop 208 on the ballot, is that this is going to give Arizona schools the resources to move us in the right direction to reach those metrics in the progress meter.
Excellent. We're almost, well, we are ready for our closing statements, and we'll go in the reverse order in which we started. So, David Lujan, your closing statement for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, and thank you again to the Arizona Republic for hosting this. Thank you, Jaime. You know, so many students have gone through our public education system, starting in kindergarten and going through all 12 years of their K-12 education system for the last 20 years, really, in one of the most underfunded public education systems in the country. And just think of what that has already done to our current workforce, to our current economy. Yes, it was going strong before the pandemic, but how many more businesses would have moved here had we made the right investments 20 years ago? How many more kids would have better, outcomes had we had those investments? And so what we want from Prop 208 is to make sure that those kids who are entering kindergarten, first, second, third grade are not going to have to go through all 12 years in such an underfunded school system. We want to give them the resources, and so that's why we ask all Arizonans to please vote yes on Prop 208. You can get more information at investined.com. Thank you.
And for his closing argument, not closing argument, this isn't court, closing statement, Jaime Molera.
I just want to say also thank you, Richard, and thank you to the Arizona Republic and David for this opportunity to bring this before the Arizona voters. You know, this campaign has been interesting for me in that it's been sometimes very frustrating, sometimes very ugly. I was attacked personally and very publicly. My business was attacked for believing in what I believe and believing that we should have a better structure of how Arizonans get taxed, and we should have a better accountability system to make sure that every kid, regardless of where they live, has been able to have access. One of the things that I'm most proud of is that I've been working on public policy issues, whether it was Prop 301, whether it was Prop 100, that was the temporary tax that helped Arizona get out of the Great Recession, whether it was 123, trying to get more resources into the system. I've even been involved in major public policy issues like the Medicaid restoration and Medicaid fight. So I'm proud of being able to bring people together and actually have good outcomes. This didn't bring anybody together. If you go to No Prop 208 AZ, you can see Arizona businesses that will say, look at this, and you realize it's a bad plan.
Thank you, gentlemen, both, and thank you for joining us, spending some of your Tuesday night with us for what I hope you found an informative debate. If you're confused and want to read more, AZ Central has covered this topic extensively, so please click around and keep following our coverage on this and other topics. Tomorrow night here at AZ Central at 7 o'clock is the Proposition 207 debate, the legalization of recreational marijuana. Thursday at 3 o'clock is the Gilbert mayoral debate. Thank you for joining us. I'm Richard Rellis. Good night.